For decades, Washington described Venezuela's crisis in familiar terms: a corrupt regime, a broken economy, and a state entangled with drug traffickers. But in late 2025, the language suddenly changed. The United States officially labeled Venezuela's Cartel de los Soles not just as a narco network, but as a foreign terrorist organization, placing it on the same list as groups like Hezbollah and the Shining Path, and tying it directly to President Nicolas Maduro and senior officers in the Venezuelan state. In practical terms, this step transforms a criminal investigation into a counter-terrorism campaign. It turns drug trafficking routes into potential battlefields and sends a signal to every government and company interacting with Venezuela. Dealing with this network is no longer just a sanctions risk. It is a terrorism risk. So what exactly is Cartel de los Soles? Why did the United States escalate from sanctions to a terror designation? And how does this move reshape U.S. strategy in Latin America, from legal tools and financial pressure to military deployments in the Caribbean? In the next few minutes, we'll unpack how a label on paper is quietly rewriting the rules of power in the hemisphere, and why it matters far beyond Venezuela's borders. In November 2025, the U.S. State Department added Cartel de los Soles to its official list of foreign terrorist organizations. The designation took effect after publication in the Federal Register and a period in which Congress could have intervened, but did not. By then, groundwork had already been laid. Months earlier, the U.S. Treasury had designated the network under counter-terrorism authorities, describing it as a structure headed by Nicolas Maduro and high-ranking regime figures who use Venezuelan state institutions to move drugs and support criminal groups such as Tren de Aragua and the Sinaloa Cartel. Washington began speaking of violent narco-terrorists, explicitly linking drug flows to broader security threats. At the same time, the United States was reshaping its posture in the region. A major naval deployment in 2025 brought thousands of troops, amphibious assault ships, and destroyers into the Caribbean, officially as part of a counter-narcotics operation targeting groups including Cartel de los Soles. Officials suggested that the designation unlocked a whole bunch of new options, signaling a broader toolkit than traditional anti-drug policy. Several Latin American governments soon mirrored the U.S. label, aligning their own legal frameworks with Washington. On the surface, the story is about cocaine, cartels, and sanctions. But the designation does something far more significant. It reclassifies a state-linked network in Latin America as a terrorist actor, shifting the region into a new security category. To understand why this matters, we need to look at what Cartel de los Soles really is, and what it is not. The term first appeared in the 1990s when investigators probed senior Venezuelan officers for drug trafficking. The Sons referred to the insignias worn by military generals. Over the 2000s and 2010s, as Venezuela became entangled in cocaine transit from Colombia, the term evolved into a description of a loose network of officers, officials, and intermediaries embedded within the state, especially in the military and intelligence services. U.S. indictments in 2020 and after accused Maduro and senior allies of conspiring with Colombian guerrilla groups to flood the United States with cocaine, blending trafficking with security alliances. Investigations suggested that Venezuela served as a major transit hub for cocaine headed not only to the U.S. but also to Europe. Corruption within the state blurred the line between official institutions and criminal networks. Yet many analysts argue that Cartel de los Soles is not a cartel in the traditional sense. It lacks a clear hierarchy, a unified brand, or a public leadership structure comparable to groups like Sinaloa. Instead, it resembles a fragmented ecosystem of state-embedded actors using their positions to facilitate and profit from trafficking. That nuance is crucial, because when Washington labels such a network as terrorist, it is effectively labeling parts of a state itself as a terrorist structure. The designation sits at the intersection of domestic U.S. politics, regional security, and Venezuelan power struggles. For Washington, particularly under a hardline approach to Caracas, the label escalates pressure on Maduro and his inner circle, casting them not simply as corrupt leaders, but as narco-terrorists. It creates a legal architecture that makes providing material support to the network a serious federal crime and strengthens the justification for expanded financial surveillance, asset freezes, and cooperation with allies. For the Pentagon and security agencies, the shift supports a narrative that moves drug enforcement into counter-terrorism logic. The Venezuelan government rejects the very existence of Cartel de los Soles as defined by Washington and accuses the U.S. of manufacturing a pretext for regime change. Domestically, this narrative can rally internal support around claims of sovereignty under attack and portray the label as evidence of Washington's willingness to escalate beyond sanctions. Regional governments that adopted the designation gain closer security, ties with the United States, and a clearer basis to prosecute actors linked to the network, though doing so requires balancing relations with Caracas and domestic sensitivities. Criminal groups such as Tren de Aragua and the Sinaloa Cartel, accused of receiving support from the network, face heightened risk as financial channels become harder to conceal and cooperation with state-embedded actors comes under greater scrutiny. But the real impact of the FTO label lies in how it retools the entire U.S. playbook in Latin America. Strategically, calling Cartel de los Soles a foreign terrorist organization has major implications. Legally and financially, the designation makes providing material support a crime, triggers visa refusals, and pushes global banks and companies to expand compliance measures. For Latin America, this intensifies the need to distance financial institutions from Venezuelan state-linked actors and forces businesses to reevaluate exposure to terrorism-related penalties. Security-wise, the designation reframes drug trafficking networks as narco-terrorist threats, aligning hemispheric security with post-9/11 counter-terrorism logic. It helps justify large-scale U.S. naval operations and deployments in the Caribbean as part of an anti-terror campaign, rather than a conventional counter-drug mission. While the label does not authorize military action on its own, it lays political and legal groundwork for expanded intelligence collection, interdiction operations, and closer cooperation with regional partners. By treating a state-embedded Venezuelan network as a terrorist actor, Washington signals to regional and extra-regional powers the costs of deep alignment with Caracas. In other words, Cartel de los Soles is not just about cocaine routes anymore. It has become a legal hinge that can swing U.S. policy from sanctions and diplomacy toward a more militarized posture in the hemisphere. Looking ahead, several paths are possible. One trajectory involves intensified financial and judicial pressure, with the FTO label used primarily as a legal weapon. U.S. agencies could pursue more indictments under terrorism statutes, while regional allies harmonize their laws and banks adopt zero-tolerance strategies. In this scenario, the battlefield becomes the courtroom and the compliance department. Another path leads to a more militarized Caribbean. The designation could justify semi-permanent naval deployments, expanded basing rights, and increased maritime interdictions targeting vessels suspected of ties to the network. Over time, parts of the Caribbean could evolve into a security corridor dominated by U.S. and allied forces. A quieter scenario revolves around negotiation and conditional relief. Elements within the Venezuelan state, facing mounting legal and political risk, might seek limited bargains involving cooperation on specific cases in exchange for targeted easing. Regional governments could act as intermediaries, turning the FTO label into leverage rather than a trigger for confrontation. The most dangerous path involves escalation and miscalculation. A maritime interdiction or targeted operation could go wrong, leading to casualties or diplomatic crises. Caracas might retaliate with arrests, expulsions, or forced mobilizations, while external actors exploit the chaos to pursue their own agendas. Here, the boundary between counter-narcotics, counter-terrorism, and broader geopolitical confrontation becomes increasingly blurred. Which trajectory dominates will depend on how Washington applies its new tools and how Caracas and its neighbors choose to respond. The designation of Cartel de los Soles as a foreign terrorist organization marks a turning point in how the United States frames security threats in Latin America. On one level, it is the culmination of decades of allegations, indictments, sanctions, and diplomatic isolation. On another level, It is a strategic experiment in applying terrorism frameworks to state-embedded criminal networks. The question is whether such tools can be used without destabilizing an entire region, and whether militarized postures and legal designations can meaningfully reduce drug flows or simply reshape alliances. For Latin America, the implications extend far beyond Venezuela, raising broader questions about sovereignty, security cooperation, and great power competition. For Washington, the move signals a willingness to treat elements of a hostile state apparatus not just as adversaries, but as part of a terrorist ecosystem, a step that is difficult to reverse. In the years ahead, the real significance of the Sol's cartel designation will be measured not only in seizures or arrests, but in how it redefines the boundaries of U.S. power projection, legal authority, and risk tolerance in the Western Hemisphere. Thank you for watching the Atlas Report. If you enjoyed this analysis, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next documentary. Your support helps us continue exploring global power, strategic geography, and the forces shaping world events. We appreciate your time. See you in the next report.